I was sold in under 3 minutes, and the man who bought me didn't even look at me the way I expected. The clock on the wall read 9:14 p.m., the second hand ticking louder than my heartbeat, or maybe that was just in my head, because everything felt too sharp, too real, like the world had suddenly decided to slow down just to make sure I felt every second of it, every breath, every glance, every word my father said as he leaned across the table with that tired, desperate smile he used when he wanted something he didn't deserve. "She's strong," he said, like he was talking about a used car, like I wasn't standing 10 feet away in the doorway, gripping the edge of the wall so hard my fingers hurt. "She'll do whatever you need." I didn't cry. I didn't move. I had learned a long time ago that reacting only made things worse, so I stood there in silence, watching the man across from him, the one in the perfectly tailored suit, the one whose presence made the entire room feel smaller, quieter, like even the air knew to behave. Victor Hale. I didn't know his name yet, but I felt it in the way everyone else in the room avoided his eyes, in the way the two men standing behind him didn't shift, didn't blink, didn't exist outside of his command. He didn't interrupt. He didn't negotiate. He just listened, his gaze steady, unreadable, like he was measuring something invisible, something deeper than money or words. My father kept talking, filling the silence with excuses, promises, numbers that sounded too big for a house like ours, for a life like mine, and then it happened, just like that, a single nod, a quiet agreement, a decision made without ceremony. "Done," my father said, too quickly, too eagerly, like he was afraid the moment might disappear if he didn't grab it fast enough, and I felt something inside me go still, not break, not shatter, just stop. Because that was it. That was the moment my life changed, and it didn't come with a scream or a struggle or anything dramatic enough to match the weight of it. It came with paperwork. With a pen sliding across cheap wood. With a man who finally looked at me, not with hunger, not with cruelty, but with something colder, something harder to understand. His eyes didn't linger on my face. They didn't travel over me the way I had feared. They just held. Calm. Calculating. Certain. And for a second, I forgot how to breathe. Because there was no excitement in his expression. No satisfaction. Just a quiet kind of resolve that made my stomach twist in a way I couldn't explain. "Get your things," my father muttered, not even looking at me now, already reaching for the envelope that had appeared on the table like magic, thick and heavy and worth more than anything I had ever owned. I didn't move right away. I kept my eyes on the man who had just bought me, waiting for something, anything that would confirm what I thought this was, what it had to be, because there was no other explanation that made sense. But he didn't say a word. He just stood, adjusted his cufflinks with slow, precise movements, and turned toward the door like this was nothing more than another transaction in a long day of business. And that was the first thing that felt wrong. Not what my father did. Not the deal. But the fact that the most powerful man I had ever seen looked at me like I wasn't something he owned, but something he had already decided to protect. The ride to his estate took exactly 42 minutes, and I counted every single one because it was the only thing I could control, the passing streetlights blurring into long streaks of gold against the window while the city I had known my entire life slowly disappeared behind us, replaced by quieter roads, wider spaces, and a kind of silence that felt expensive, intentional, like even noise needed permission to exist here. And no one in the car spoke, not the driver, not the two men seated across from me, and certainly not Victor Hale, who sat beside me without ever touching me, without even letting his sleeve brush against mine, a deliberate distance that felt louder than anything he could have said, and I kept waiting for instructions, for rules, for some kind of claim to be made, but there was nothing, just the low hum of the engine and the steady rhythm of my own breathing as I stared at my hands folded tightly in my lap, noticing how small they looked against the dark fabric of my jeans, how out of place I felt already, like I had stepped into a life that was not meant for me and would not keep me for long, and when the gates finally appeared, tall and iron and opening without a sound as if they had been expecting us all along, I felt my chest tighten in a way I could not explain, because this was real now, not a conversation, not a threat, Not something I could pretend was temporary, and the house beyond them was not just large, it was precise, every light placed perfectly, every line clean and controlled, the kind of place where nothing happened by accident, and that thought stayed with me as the car came to a smooth stop in front of the entrance, as one of the men stepped out to open my door, as I hesitated for half a second before moving, because stepping out meant accepting something I was not ready to understand, but I did it anyway, my feet hitting the stone driveway, my eyes lifting slowly to take it all in, the height, the silence, the absence of anything familiar, and still, no one rushed me, no one grabbed me, no one forced me forward, and that was the second thing that felt wrong, because I had expected urgency, control, something that made it clear I did not belong to myself anymore, but instead there was patience, measured and calm, as if I had all the time in the world to realize what had already happened. And when I finally stepped inside, the air changed, cooler, softer, carrying a faint scent of something clean and distant, nothing like the house I had left behind, and I became painfully aware of every detail, the polished floors, the quiet footsteps, the way people moved out of the way without being told, and then his voice, low, steady, cutting through everything without effort, "She is not to be disturbed," and I froze, because he was not speaking to me, he was speaking about me, issuing instructions that carried weight I could feel in the way everyone immediately adjusted, in the way no one questioned him, and for the first time since this began, I turned to look at him fully, searching for something that made sense, something that explained why the man who had just purchased my life was setting boundaries around me instead of claiming them, and he met my gaze without hesitation, without softness but without cruelty either, just that same quiet certainty, and for a moment, I forgot the fear I was supposed to feel, replaced by something more dangerous, something that made my thoughts slow and my instincts hesitate, because nothing about this matched the story I had already written in my head, and as he turned away, already walking down the long hallway without checking if I followed, I realized the truth I was not ready to face yet, that whatever this was, whatever he had planned, it was not what I had been sold to expect, and somehow that made it even harder to breathe. He did not slow down to see if I followed, and that was the third thing that felt wrong, because every instinct I had told me to stop, to stay where I was, to make him turn around and acknowledge me, but something in the way he walked, steady, certain, like the entire world moved in response to his decisions, pulled me forward before I could think better of it. My footsteps quieter than I expected against the polished floor as I kept a careful distance behind him, watching, measuring, trying to understand a man who had not once looked back to check if I was still there, as if he already knew I would be, and that thought settled somewhere uncomfortable in my chest, because it felt less like control and more like certainty, the kind that did not need to be enforced to be real, and when he finally stopped, it was in front of a door at the end of a long hallway lined with soft lighting and walls that held nothing personal, no photos, no signs of a life lived, just perfection, just order. And he opened it without hesitation, stepping aside just enough for me to enter first, a gesture that should have felt polite but instead made me hesitate, because nothing about this situation was normal, nothing about him was predictable, and I stood there for a second too long before forcing myself to move, crossing the threshold into a room that was larger than the entire apartment I had grown up in, the bed perfectly made, the windows stretching from floor to ceiling, the city lights far in the distance like something I had already left behind, and I turned slowly, expecting him to follow, expecting him to take control of the space the way he seemed to control everything else, but he did not. He remained by the door, one hand resting lightly against the frame, his posture relaxed but intentional, like he had already decided how this would go and saw no reason to rush it, and for the first time since I had stepped into this house, he spoke directly to me, his voice low, even, carrying no edge of threat, no unnecessary force, just quiet authority. "This is your room," and the simplicity of it caught me off guard, because it sounded like a statement, not a command, and I found my voice before I could stop myself, softer than I intended but steady enough to hold, for how long, and he studied me for a moment, not surprised by the question, not irritated, just assessing, like he was weighing something beyond the words themselves, and when he answered, it was without hesitation, "As long as you need," and something in me reacted to that, sharp and immediate, because that was not the answer I had expected, not the answer that made sense in a situation like this, and I took a step back, my arms crossing instinctively, building a barrier that felt too small to matter. "That is not how this works," I said, more to myself than to him, but he heard it anyway. Of course he did, and there was the faintest shift in his expression, not a smile, not even close, but something softer than before, something that made it harder to hold on to the fear I had brought with me. "It is how this works," he replied, and I shook my head, because no, that was not possible, not with a man like him, not with the way this started. "You paid for me." The words tasted wrong the moment I said them, heavy and cold, but they were the truth I understood, the only version of reality that made sense, and for a second, just a second, something changed in his eyes, something deeper, something I could not name, before it was gone again, replaced by that same controlled calm. "No," he said quietly, and the single word carried more weight than anything else he had said so far, stopping my thoughts mid-breath, forcing me to look at him in a way I had been trying to avoid. I paid for a mistake to be corrected, and my chest tightened, because that was not better, that was not clearer, that was something else entirely, something that shifted the ground beneath everything I thought I understood, and before I could ask what that meant, before I could push further, he straightened slightly, stepping back into the hallway, already putting distance between us again. "You are safe here," he added, and I almost laughed, because safe was not a word that belonged anywhere near this situation, not in this house, not with this man, not after what had just happened, but the way he said it, without hesitation, without doubt, made it harder to dismiss than it should have been, and as the door closed behind him with a soft, final click, I stood there in the center of a room that did not feel like a prison, not yet, not quite, and realized that the most dangerous part of all of this was not what I feared he might do, but the growing suspicion that he had no intention of doing any of it at all. I did not sleep that night, not because the bed was unfamiliar or the room too quiet, but because nothing made sense, and my mind refused to let it go, replaying every second, every word, every look Victor Hale had given me, like there was something hidden inside it that I had missed, something important enough to change everything if I could just understand it. But the more I thought about it, the less it fit, because men like him did not correct mistakes, they made them disappear. And yet here I was, untouched, alone, in a room that felt more like a guest suite than a cage, and that thought alone kept me awake as the hours passed, the city lights outside slowly dimming until dawn began to creep in through the floor-to-ceiling windows, soft and pale, like the world outside had moved on without me, and maybe it had, maybe the life I knew ended the moment that door closed behind him, and this was something else entirely, something I did not have a name for yet. And when I finally stood, my body stiff from sitting too long on the edge of the bed, I realized something else that did not make sense. The door was not locked. I tested it slowly, half expecting resistance, some sign that this was still what I thought it was, but the handle turned easily, the door opening into the same quiet hallway as before, empty, still, like the house itself was holding its breath, and for a moment I just stood there, looking out, waiting for someone to stop me, for a voice to call me back, for the illusion of freedom to break, but nothing happened, so I stepped out, one cautious step at a time, my senses sharper now, noticing things I had missed before, the subtle presence of cameras tucked into corners, the faint sound of movement somewhere far below, the kind of quiet that was not empty but controlled, observed, and that realization settled heavily in my chest, because this was not freedom, not really, it was something more calculated, something that gave the appearance of choice without actually offering it, and I followed the hallway without direction, letting instinct guide me toward the wide staircase at the center of the house, each step downward bringing a strange mix of fear and curiosity I could not ignore, and when I reached the bottom, I saw him again, exactly where I should have expected him to be, standing near a long dining table that looked like it belonged in a place much larger than a home, a cup of coffee in his hand, untouched, his attention focused on something in front of him that I could not see yet, and he did not look surprised when I approached, did not question why I was there, did not react at all until I was close enough to hear the quiet clink of ceramic as he set the cup down. "You should eat," he said, as if this were normal, as if I had simply come downstairs in a house that belonged to me, and I stopped a few feet away, refusing to move closer, refusing to accept the calm he was offering so easily. "Why am I here?" I asked, the question sharper now, more direct, because I was done guessing, done trying to fit this into something that made sense, and he looked at me then, really looked, his eyes steady, unflinching. And for a moment I thought he might finally give me the truth, something clear, something real, but instead he reached for a folder on the table, sliding it across the surface toward me with slow precision, and I hesitated before taking it, my fingers brushing the edge like it might disappear if I moved too fast, and when I opened it, the air in my lungs caught, not from fear, not this time, but from recognition, because the name printed on the first page was not his, and it was not mine, it was someone I had not heard in years, someone I had almost forgotten, and yet somehow, they were here, connected to this, to him, to everything, and when I looked back up, my voice came out quieter than I intended. What is this? And Victor Hale did not look away as he answered, his tone unchanged, controlled, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that made my pulse slow instead of race. The reason you are not what he sold. I did not realize I had stopped breathing until the silence stretched too long and my chest started to ache, the name on the page pulling at something buried deep in my memory, something fragile and unfinished, and my fingers tightened slightly around the folder as I forced myself to read it again, slower this time, like the letters might rearrange themselves into something easier to understand, but they did not, they stayed exactly the same, clear and undeniable, and my voice came out quieter than before, almost unsteady. I know this name, and Victor Hale did not react with surprise, did not question it, as if he had expected that answer all along. You should, he replied, his tone even, measured, like he was guiding me toward something I had to see for myself, not something he intended to explain too quickly, and I shook my head, not in denial but in confusion, because knowing the name did not mean understanding why it was here, why it mattered, why it was sitting in a file in the home of a man who had just paid for my life. This does not make sense, I said, the words coming faster now, my thoughts catching up with the weight of it all. What does this have to do with me? And for a moment, just a moment, he looked at me in a way that felt different, not distant, not calculating, but almost careful, like the next words mattered more than anything he had said so far. Everything, he answered, and the single word landed heavier than I expected, settling somewhere deep in my chest, because it was not dramatic, it was not exaggerated, it was certain, and certainty from a man like him carried a different kind of truth, one I could not easily dismiss, and I looked back down at the file, forcing myself to turn the page, my eyes scanning the details, the dates, the connections that slowly began to form a pattern I had not been prepared to see, small pieces of a past I had tried not to think about, fragments of conversations, memories that never fully made sense when I was younger, and suddenly they were not fragments anymore, they were part of something larger, something real, and my heart started to beat faster, not from fear this time, but from the unsettling realization that my life had not been as simple as I believed, that there were things hidden from me, things my father never explained, things that connected me to people I did not even know existed, and I closed the folder slowly, my hands steadier now, my thoughts sharper, because confusion was beginning to turn into something else, something more focused, more dangerous. You knew, I said, lifting my eyes back to him, searching his expression for any sign that I was wrong, but there was none, just that same calm presence, that same quiet control. Before last night, you knew who I was, and he did not hesitate, did not soften the truth or reshape it into something easier to accept. Yes, he said, and the simplicity of it sent a wave of frustration through me, sharp and immediate, because that meant this was not random, not impulsive, not a decision made in a moment of opportunity. It was planned, calculated, deliberate. So this was never about him, I continued, my voice stronger now, more certain. My father was just convenient, and again, no denial, no attempt to correct me, just a slight shift in his posture that felt like confirmation, and I let out a slow breath, trying to steady the storm building inside me, because this changed everything. It meant I was not just caught in someone else's mistake, I was part of something much larger, something that had been moving long before I realized it, and that realization settled heavily in my chest, not as fear, but as awareness, because if he had planned this, if he had known, then there was only one question left that mattered, and I asked it without hesitation, my eyes locked on his, refusing to look away this time. Then why me? And for the first time since I met him, Victor Hale did not answer immediately, the silence stretching just long enough to feel intentional, not uncertain, like he was deciding how much of the truth I was ready to hear, and when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but carrying something deeper beneath it, something that made the air in the room feel heavier, because you were never supposed to be left behind. The words did not land all at once, they unfolded slowly, like something my mind refused to accept in a single moment, and I stood there staring at him, trying to decide if I had heard him correctly, because nothing about that sentence fit into the version of my life I had been holding onto for years. I was never left behind, I repeated, the words sounding foreign even as they left my mouth, and he did not correct me, did not soften it, just watched me with that same steady focus, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment, this exact question. No, he said, calm, certain, you were taken out of something you were meant to be part of, and my chest tightened, not from fear but from something sharper, something closer to disbelief, because that implied there had been something before, something I had belonged to, something that had been interrupted, and I shook my head again, slower this time, trying to piece together memories that suddenly felt incomplete. That is not possible, I said, but the words lacked conviction, because even as I spoke them, images began to surface, small, disconnected moments from my childhood that I had never questioned, a different house, brighter, quieter, a voice that was not my father's, softer, familiar in a way I could never fully place, and I swallowed, my grip tightening around the folder as the edges of those memories began to sharpen. I would remember, I added, but it sounded weaker than I intended, because deep down, I was not sure anymore, and Victor Hale stepped closer then, not invading my space, not forcing anything, just closing the distance enough to make his presence undeniable. You remember what you were allowed to keep, he said, and the statement settled heavily in the air between us, because it was not an accusation, it was a fact, and something about that made it harder to argue, harder to dismiss, and I looked back down at the file, flipping through the pages again, searching for something that made this clearer, something that proved this was not just a carefully constructed story, but every detail only raised more questions, dates that did not align with what I had been told, names that felt distant but not entirely unfamiliar, and I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to focus. Because if this was real, if even part of this was true, then my entire understanding of my life had been incomplete, and that meant the man standing in front of me was not just someone who had changed my present, he was someone who knew my past better than I did, and that realization made my voice quieter when I spoke again, more controlled, more deliberate. Then tell me what I was part of, and this time, he did not avoid the question, but he did not answer it directly either, his gaze shifting briefly to the folder before returning to me, as if the answer was not something he could simply say, but something I had to see. You were part of a promise, he said, and the word promise lingered in my mind longer than anything else he had said so far, because it carried something different, something that did not belong in the world I thought he came from, something that sounded almost human, and I frowned slightly, trying to understand how a promise could lead to this, to me. Standing here in his house, holding pieces of a past I did not recognize. What kind of promise? I asked, and for the first time, there was a pause that felt heavier than before, not hesitation, but something closer to restraint, like he was choosing how much to reveal, how far to push me into something I was clearly not ready to face all at once. And when he finally spoke, his voice was lower, quieter, but carrying a weight that settled deep in my chest. One that was broken, he said, and the simplicity of it made my stomach twist, because broken promises had consequences, consequences that stretched across time, across people, across lives. And suddenly, this was not just about me being taken, or sold, or brought here, it was about something that had been set in motion long before I understood it, something that had reached back into my life and pulled me into a reality I had never seen coming. And as I stood there, holding the truth in my hands and still not fully understanding it, one thought settled in with quiet certainty: I had not been chosen by accident, and whatever this promise was, whatever had been broken, I was standing in the middle of its aftermath. The word broken stayed with me longer than it should have, echoing in a way that made everything feel heavier, more intentional, and I realized I was no longer just reacting, I was thinking, connecting pieces that had never been meant to fit together until now. And I lifted my eyes back to him, studying his face with a new kind of focus, not just fear or confusion, but something sharper, something closer to understanding. You were part of it, I said, not as a question but as a realization. Because the way he spoke about it, the way he carried it, this was not distant to him, it was personal, and he did not deny it, did not look away, just held my gaze with that same steady intensity. I made it, he said, and the simplicity of the admission sent a quiet shock through me, because that meant whatever this promise was, whatever had been broken, he was not just involved, he was responsible. And I felt my grip tighten slightly on the folder, my thoughts racing faster now. With who? I pressed, needing clarity, needing something solid to hold on to, and for a moment, just a moment, something shifted in his expression, not weakness, not regret, but something close to memory, something that did not belong in the present. Your mother, he said, and everything inside me went still, not dramatically, not suddenly, but completely, like a switch had been flipped somewhere deep inside my chest, because that was not a name I heard often, not a person I had ever truly known, just a quiet absence in my life that no one ever explained, and I stared at him, searching for any sign that this was a mistake, that he had said the wrong thing, but there was none, only certainty, and I shook my head slowly, not rejecting it but trying to understand how that could possibly be true. That is not possible, I said, but again, the words felt weaker than before, because something in me had already started to shift, already started to accept that maybe the life I remembered was not the full story. I would know, I added, but even as I said it, I was not sure anymore, and he stepped closer again, not enough to overwhelm, just enough to make his presence impossible to ignore. You were too young, he replied, and there was no judgment in his voice, no attempt to push, just a quiet statement that made the truth harder to argue against. And I looked down at the folder again, flipping through the pages with more urgency now, searching for her name, for anything that connected her to this man standing in front of me, and when I found it, when I saw her name written next to his, something inside me tightened in a way I could not explain, because it was real, it was documented, it was undeniable, and I exhaled slowly, trying to steady myself as the weight of it settled in. What kind of promise did you make with her? I asked, my voice quieter now, more controlled, because this was no longer just about me, it was about something that existed before I even understood what was happening, and this time, he did not hesitate, did not redirect, did not soften it. To keep you safe, he said. And the words landed differently than anything else he had said so far, not sharp, not heavy, but grounding, like they carried a truth that had been waiting for me to hear it, and I frowned slightly, because that did not align with anything I had experienced, not with the life I had lived, not with the choices that had been made around me. That promise failed, I said, the logic simple, the conclusion unavoidable, because if that had been the intention, then something had gone wrong, something had broken in a way that left me where I was before last night, and for the first time since this conversation began, there was something unmistakable in his expression, something darker, not anger, not quite regret, but something that carried weight, history, consequence. Yes, he said quietly, and the honesty in that single word made it harder to look away, harder to dismiss him as just another man in control of a situation, because this was not control, this was something else, something that had been carried for years, something that had not been resolved until now, and I felt my thoughts shift again, aligning into something clearer, something more dangerous, because if he had failed once, then bringing me here was not random, it was correction, it was intention, it was him trying to fix something that should have never been broken in the first place. And as I looked at him, really looked at him this time, I realized something that changed everything. He had not bought me to own me, he had come back for me because he never stopped believing I was his responsibility. The realization did not comfort me the way it should have, it did not soften the edges of what had happened or make the past easier to accept. Instead it shifted something deeper, something more unsettling, because responsibility meant intention, and intention meant this had never been a coincidence, not the timing, not the way he appeared, not the fact that he knew exactly where to find me when everything fell apart. And I took a slow step back, creating space between us as my thoughts caught up with that truth. You waited, I said, the words quieter but sharper than before, because if he had known, if he had carried this promise for years, then he had also chosen when to act, and that choice mattered. You knew where I was, what my life was like, and you still waited until now. And this time, he did not answer immediately, not because he did not have one, but because the answer was not Simple, and I saw it in the way his jaw tightened slightly, in the brief shift of his gaze before it returned to mine, steady as always. I was not the only one watching, he said, and that was not the reassurance it might have sounded like, not when it introduced something else, something I had not considered, and my chest tightened again, not from fear but from awareness, because that meant there were other people, other forces, other reasons why my life had unfolded the way it did, and I shook my head slightly, trying to stay focused, trying to keep this from slipping into something too large to understand. That does not answer the question, I said, and for the first time, there was a hint of something else in his expression, something closer to acknowledgement, like he knew I deserved more than fragments. No, he agreed quietly, it does not, and the honesty of that made it harder to push back, harder to dismiss him as someone who was simply controlling the narrative. Because he was not hiding behind easy answers, he was choosing what to reveal and when, and that meant there was more, much more, and I exhaled slowly, forcing myself to stay grounded, because this was not about everything else, not yet. This was about him, about the decision he made, about the moment he stepped into my life and changed it completely. So tell me the truth, I said, my voice steadier now, more certain. Why now? And this time, he did not look away, did not pause, did not soften it, because the moment he signed that paper, you were no longer protected by anything, he said, and the words landed with a clarity that cut through everything else, because they were not dramatic, they were not exaggerated, they were factual, and something about that made them more real, more immediate, and I felt my breath catch slightly as the meaning settled in, because that meant the transaction itself had changed something, had removed whatever barrier had been in place before. And I looked down at the folder again, the pieces aligning faster now, forming a picture I was not sure I wanted to see. So you stepped in, I said, more to myself than to him, but he confirmed it anyway. Yes, and I let out a slow breath, my thoughts moving through everything that had happened, everything that had led to this moment, and for the first time, I saw it differently, not as a sudden decision, not as an act of power, but as a response, a correction to something that had shifted beyond his control. And that realization settled heavily in my chest, because it meant my life had been balanced on something fragile for longer than I ever knew, something that had finally broken, forcing him to act, and I looked back up at him, my gaze sharper now, more focused, and if he had not done it, I asked, the question forming before I could stop it, if my father had not signed anything, would you have left me there? And this time, the silence felt different, not calculated, not restrained, but honest in a way that made it harder to breathe, and when he answered, his voice was quieter than before, but no less certain. No, he said, and the simplicity of it sent a quiet shock through me, because that meant this was inevitable, not in the way I had thought before, not as something random or forced, but as something that had been moving toward this point for years, waiting for the right moment, the right reason, the right break in whatever had been holding it back, and I realized then that this was not just about being saved. It was about being found, and as I stood there in the middle of a life I no longer recognized, one truth settled in with undeniable clarity: he had not come into my life because of what my father did, he had been on his way long before that ever happened. The truth settled into me slowly, not as a shock anymore but as something heavier, something that demanded a decision, because understanding why he came was only part of it, the rest was what I was going to do with that knowledge, and I stood there looking at him, really looking this time, not as the man who bought me, not as the stranger who changed everything overnight, but as someone who had been connected to my life long before I ever knew it, someone who had carried a promise I never asked for and still chose to keep it, even after it was broken, and that realization shifted something inside me, something I had been holding onto since the moment this started, the fear, the resistance, the need to fight something I did not understand, and for the first time, it felt different, not gone, but quieter, less certain, and I let out a slow breath, my grip on the folder loosening slightly as I placed it back on the table, because I did not need to hold onto it anymore. Not when the truth was already in front of me. So what happens now? I asked. And my voice did not shake, it did not break, it held steady in a way I had not expected, because this was not about what had been done to me anymore, it was about what came next, and he watched me for a moment, longer than before, like he was measuring something again, not my fear this time, but something else, something that mattered more, that depends on you, he said, and I blinked slightly, caught off guard by the answer. Because that was not how this was supposed to work, not with someone like him, not in a situation like this, and